Ascension Parish, Louisiana, November 29, 1849.
They never expected to die on Thanksgiving. Not like this. Not all 10 of them. The great hall of the Delacroix plantation shimmered with candlelight, every flicker bouncing off mahogany panels, gold-framed portraits and polished silverware. The aroma of roasted duck mingled with honey-glazed ham, collard greens, and cornbread thick with molasses. Wine bottles stood like sentinels between every place setting, their dark glass sweating in the southern heat. 10 white men gathered around the long oak table, their laughter rolling like thunder through the chandeliered chamber. Some were planters, others overseers, judges, merchants, all of them rich, all of them powerful, all of them untouchable. The toast was simple. "To the bounty of the land," one said, raising his goblet, "and to those who work it," another added, chuckling darkly, eyes flicking toward the window, toward the slave quarters they pretended not to see. Goblets clinked, laughter rose again. Red wine, thick, sweet, sloshed down greedy throats. Then, a cough, a gasp, a thud. The first man dropped his fork, eyes wide, veins bulging in. His temples. The second slumped sideways, knocking over a decanter of bourbon. The third tried to stand, but collapsed face first into his sweet potatoes. Panic erupted. Chairs scraped, plates shattered. One clawed at his throat. One convulsed so violently he cracked his head on the table's edge. Another vomited blood onto the linen. It soaked through like ink on parchment. The youngest among them, barely 20, tried to scream, but foam bubbled at his lips. His knees gave out, his body crumpled. His final breath gurgled in his chest. You can almost hear it now, can't you? The wet gasps, the choking, the splatter of wine and bile mixing on polished wood, the smell of roasted duck, suddenly tainted with iron. Goblets spilled across the table. Silverware clattered to the floor. One man died gripping a turkey leg in his fist. Another died praying, his blood soaking through his prayer book. And in the far corner of the room, unnoticed, untouched, stood a shadow. A tall, dark-skinned man. No shoes, no voice, no name that any of them had cared to remember. His eyes, still. His body, motionless, but his presence, undeniable. Absalom. For years he had moved through this house like smoke, invisible. A silent servant, a pair of hands to fetch wine, a back to carry crates, a face to forget. But tonight, he did not move. He watched. He watched as men who once spat orders at him now drowned in their own breath. As masters who once beat him collapsed in their own waste. As a system that had silenced him for decades fell silent itself. Outside, through the cracked shutters, the cicadas screamed. Inside, only the dying groaned. Imagine standing in that room. Imagine knowing you were the only one left breathing. No one saw Absalom leave. No one remembered him entering. No one noticed the single goblet he carried with him, the one he never drank from. But they would remember the aftermath, the scandal, the whispers, the silence that followed. A silence as cold as the corpses left, cooling at the table. But who was Absalom? And how did a voiceless slave come to slaughter 10 of the most powerful men in Louisiana in a single night? By daylight, the Delacroix plantation shimmered like a southern dream. Red brick chimneys puffed lazy clouds into the Louisiana sky. The columns of the great house stood proud and white as bone. And everywhere, from the manicured rose gardens to the stables polished cleaner than most homes, was the illusion of peace. But illusions rot quickest in the heat. The scent of magnolias mixed with something more bitter, sweat, manure, gunpowder. The morning sun touched the silver roofs like fire, and underneath that gleam was rot. Inside the great house, 10 empty chairs waited at the long oak table, still stained red from the night before. Servants scrubbed the floor, their hands blistered, their knees trembling. No one dared ask where the masters had gone. No one dared speak the word dead. But outside, the quarters knew. They always knew. The slave cabins, barely a quarter-mile from the estate, looked more like collapsed crates than homes. Mud crusted the corners. Window holes were stuffed with rags. Rats crept beneath the floorboards. There were no pillows, only straw, no warmth, only body heat. Children huddled against their mothers, coughing, their bellies swollen with hunger. Old men sat without words, their backs permanently bent from decades in the cane fields. Women scrubbed laundry with raw hands, humming songs so old they no longer had names. Imagine living like this. Imagine waking up every day to the sound of a bell. Not an alarm, not a song, but a command. Get up. Move. Work or be whipped. Now imagine, just across the yard, a family of men laughing over eggs and brandy while you bled into cotton fields for 15 hours straight. That was the contrast. In the dining room, silk napkins, wine chilled in silver buckets, laughter that rang without consequence. In the quarters, bones cracked open to suck out marrow, salt pork, scraped clean of mold, voices whispered in fear of eavesdropping. The masters spoke of heritage, of God's will, but God, it seemed, had never stepped foot in the slave huts. One overseer, a man named Weller, made a game of breaking noses. He called it training. He would take the young ones, slam them against barn doors, twist their arms behind, their backs until bones popped. Then he'd smile. "That's how you make 'em useful," he once bragged. Ezekiel remembered that smile. He remembered the way Weller laughed as he shoved his mother down a well path, her head striking a stone, so hard it bled for 3 days. She never spoke clearly again. And Absalom? He had once been given a new pair of boots for hauling a dead mule across the field faster than the others. The next day, the boots were taken back. The master said he looked too proud. That was the punishment for pride. Barefoot in the briars, blood on your heel, a whip to remind you not to walk too tall. But then came the whispers. Something had changed. The week before Thanksgiving, food in the great house went untouched. The wine cellar was locked. Guards patrolled the halls more than usual. Rumors crawled through the quarters like spiders. They afraid of something. They heard someone's planning. You see Absalom lately? He different. Quiet, but not scared. In the fields, the slaves bent their backs and bit their tongues, but their eyes darted, watching, waiting. Even the cicadas seemed louder. Their shrill chorus didn't fade at dusk. It rose like a warning. What would it take, a voice might ask, to make you rise, knowing you might die the same day? And what happens when 10 rich men laugh too loud and forget that the hands pouring their wine have nothing left to lose? The slaves still smiled in front of their masters, still bowed, still obeyed. But something had shifted behind their eyes. And Absalom had stopped blinking altogether. Not all rebellion begins with rage. Some begin in libraries, others in silence. Ezekiel hadn't always belonged to the Bellamy estate. He was first sold at 13 to a plantation doctor in Virginia, an old man with a failing liver and a failing mind. But the doctor had no children, no wife, only his books. And for some reason no one understood. He let Ezekiel read them. Anatomy, botany, toxicology, Latin labels scrawled across parchment, drawings of herbs, organs, death. For 3 years, Ezekiel fetched the doctor's water, changed his bedpan, and read everything in that house, not just once, dozens of times. He learned which flowers cured fever, which seeds could silence pain, and which roots could stop a man's heart in 10 seconds flat. When the doctor died, Ezekiel was sold again. This time to Louisiana. No books, no candles, no soft chairs, just rows of sugarcane and a master with a short temper. But knowledge isn't so easily whipped out of a man. And Ezekiel carried his education the way others carried scars, hidden but permanent, on his. First week at the Bellamy plantation, he saw a boy whipped for stealing peaches. The lash opened him from shoulder to spine. The overseer didn't even look tired when he finished. That night, Ezekiel didn't sleep. He sat under a broken window, staring at the moon, and wondered, if a boy could be beaten nearly to death for hunger, what punishment did a master deserve for cruelty? And that's when he met Absalom. They didn't speak at first. Absalom didn't speak at all. But they worked the same fields, ate from the same troughs, and Ezekiel noticed how Absalom moved, careful, quiet, watching everything. One day, by the sugar barrels, Absalom found a dying cat, ribs crushed, eyes bulging, likely stomped by one of the white children for fun. Absalom picked it up, cradled it, sat for hours beside it. Ezekiel watched from a distance. Something in that moment cracked open the silence between them. They began to share words, slowly. Not gossip, not stories, details. "You ever seen foxglove?" Ezekiel asked one evening. Absalom nodded. "It grows near the river." They began to name plants in whispers, and then to measure them. Ezekiel would pluck leaves and describe how much it took to stop a man's breath. Absalom would map hallways of the great house in the dirt with a stick. How many steps from cellar to dining room, which floorboards creaked, which doors were always left unlocked. But this wasn't yet a plan. Not fully. It was possibility. Imagine realizing, the narrator might say, that the people who tortured you bled the same as anyone else, and that now, for once, you held something they didn't. Still, even knowledge needs a spark. For Absalom, it came on a Sunday. The master, Delacroix, had once promised him manumission, said he would free Absalom by age 30. It was written, signed, sealed. But 1 week before Absalom's 30th birthday, the paper vanished. The master laughed in his face, called it a joke, a game he played when he was drunk. Then, as punishment for asking again, he had Absalom lashed in front of the house staff. The scars ran from shoulder to ankle. That night, Absalom didn't return to his cabin. He sat beneath the same moon Ezekiel had stared at, and stared back. The next morning, he approached Ezekiel with a piece of bark. On it, carved with a nail, was a question. How long does foxglove take to kill? Ezekiel read it twice, then looked up. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He simply answered, "Depends how much you use." Some rebellions start with screams. Others begin with quiet hands, gathering roots in the dark. And now, a recipe was forming. Not for escape, not for mercy, but for thanksgiving. Thanksgiving crept closer. And with it, the quiet pulse of something unnatural. The air turned heavier. Not colder. Louisiana doesn't know winter, but heavier, thick with humidity, thick with tension. Even the wind seemed to hush itself. Inside the Bellamy plantation, preparations were underway. The Delacroix family would host a grand feast. 10 prominent men were invited. Plantation owners, judges, politicians. The finest meal in the parish. Turkeys fattened, wine ordered. Gilded plates polished until they mirrored faces too proud to see their own cruelty. But beneath that shine, in the shadows, another preparation unfolded. Slower, darker, deadlier. Ezekiel didn't call it poison. He called it a correction. Each night, he snuck to the swamplands beyond the cane fields, where the air buzzed with gnats and the soil birthed secrets. He gathered what he needed. Foxglove, to stop the heart peach pits, crushed for cyanide belladonna, silent, elegant, lethal. He dried the roots under floorboards, crushed leaves into powder, mixed drop by drop into a brown glass vial hidden beneath his sleeping mat. He tested doses, not on people, not yet, but on rats, frogs, even insects. He timed how long it took for each to die. One frog twitched for 13 minutes before its eyes went still. "Too slow," he murmured. "Needs more peach." And Absalom memorized everything else. He mapped the Delacroix dining room down to the inch. He knew which servant would pour which wine. He studied the goblets, how they were labeled, how they were stored, who drank the most, who toasted first. He walked the path from the slave quarters to the great house with his eyes closed, counting steps, every creaky floorboard, every flickering candle, every moment when someone's back would be turned. He didn't speak, but he listened to every drunken brag, every cruel joke, every whispered secret the masters thought no slave could understand, because they thought no slave mattered. Can you feel it building, like thunder before a storm, like air just before a scream? The closer the date came, the louder. The cicadas sang at night. Their screeching echoed through the trees like a warning, or perhaps a chorus. Even the other slaves noticed it. One young girl whispered, "Mr. Absalom ain't blinked in 3 days." Another said, "Ezekiel walks like he dreamin' something." But no one asked questions, not because they didn't suspect something, but because some prayers are best left unspoken. On November 28th, the day before the feast, Absalom received his instructions: clean the main hallway, polish the floor near the dining room, assist the wine steward in transporting goblets. It was a coincidence, or maybe it wasn't. That night, he met Ezekiel behind the tool shed. No words were exchanged, only a nod. Ezekiel handed him a small, tightly wrapped cloth. Inside, a vial no bigger than a thumb. The liquid inside shimmered amber red. Absalom didn't flinch. He didn't ask how much. He already knew. Ezekiel placed a hand on his shoulder, held it for a moment, then let go. They would not speak again. "What would you do," the voice might ask, "if you knew tomorrow meant life for them and death for you?" Because this wasn't just about 10 men. It was about 10,000, 10,000. Every master who ever whipped a mother while her children watched. Every overseer who laughed as a man bled in the field. Every document that promised freedom, then was burned in front of the slave who dared believe it. This was a message, written not in ink, but in wine. And when the sun rose on Thanksgiving morning, Ezekiel sat by the fire, expression calm. Absalom stepped barefoot into the house like a ghost. The goblets were already lined up. All it took was one switch. The candles were lit. The guests had arrived. The wine had been poured, and in the shadows, 2 men waited, not for salvation, but for silence. Thanksgiving night, November 29th, 1849, Ascension Parish, Louisiana. The great hall of the Delacroix plantation gleamed with gold and candlelight. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Fire roared in the hearth. Wine flowed freely into goblets that shimmered like rubies. 10 white men sat at the long oak table, their collars stiff with starch, their fingers thick with rings. Their laughter bounced off the high ceilings, smug, effortless, and cruelly content. Roasted duck, cornbread, greens with bacon grease, bourbon pecan pie, wine, sweet, spiced, aged, and standing just behind them, half shadowed by the candlelight, Absalom. He held the tray, balanced, steady, silent. Each goblet glistened under the chandelier. Each one had been handled, cleaned, refilled, rearranged. No one had questioned it. Just another mute servant in a world that never noticed the help unless something went missing. Something was about to. The master, Delacroix himself, stood first, a proud man, swollen with wine and arrogance. He raised his glass. "To the bounty of this land," he said. "To the good men who built it, and to the hands," he chuckled, "that made the labor light." Laughter, clinks of goblets. The toast rippled down the table. 10 men raised their cups. 10 gulps followed. A second, a third, then a cough. Low at first, then sharper. Then another man coughed. Then another. Someone knocked over a chair. Delacroix's glass slipped from his fingers, shattered on the floor. One man clutched his chest, stumbling back. Another vomited across the table, the liquid a horrible mix of red and black. A third screamed, just once, before collapsing backward, limbs twitching. The youngest at the table, a judge's son barely out of boyhood, grabbed for a fork like it could save him. Blood bubbled from his nose. He fell forward, choking, his face landing in a bowl of sugared yams. The quartet stopped playing. A violin screeched as the bow was dropped. A servant screamed. A chair slammed to the ground. Delacroix stood, then staggered. His legs gave out beneath him, knees cracking the polished floor. He crawled toward Absalom, eyes wide with betrayal, mouth foaming, hand outstretched as if pleading for something he never gave. Mercy. Absalom didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He only watched. You can almost hear it, can't you? The goblets shattering, the choking, the moans of dying men realizing, too late, that their power meant nothing in their final seconds. One tried to crawl to the hallway, made it 5 steps. His blood left a smear across the floor like spilled paint. Another died with a drumstick still in his fist. The meat had bitten back. And the wine. It stained everything. The linen, the silk, the floors, the mouths of the men who once tasted nothing but victory. What do you see now? 10 corpses, 10 legacies ending not with applause, but with silence. The staff scattered, some screamed, some prayed, some simply stared in horror, unsure whether to run or fall to their knees. But no one looked at Absalom. Not really. He blended into the smoke, into the flickering light, into the architecture of their ignorance. A slave couldn't do this, they thought. A mute couldn't plan this. A man with no voice. How could he scream this loud? But Absalom never needed words. His scream was in the goblets, in the stillness of his hands. In the moment Delacroix's heart gave out on the floorboards, he'd made Absalom scrub every Sunday morning. And if you were in that room, would you have run, or bowed your head, and waited your turn? Because the poison didn't care about names. It cared about power. And tonight, power died. When the final body stopped twitching, the fire still crackled in the hearth. The candles still burned. The feast still steamed on silver platters. But the air was different, thicker, darker. And in the corner, just for a moment, Absalom stood, silhouetted against the window. His eyes scanned the room once. He turned, and he vanished into the hallway like a ghost that had finally finished its haunting. 10 men had dined. 10 men had died, and Absalom had left no trace, no prints, no footprints, no witnesses, only silence, and the bitter taste of justice in the wine. By dawn, the Delacroix plantation was a graveyard wrapped in velvet. 10 bodies lay stretched across the great hall, mouths frozen mid-gasp, eyes wide with the final image they saw, their own power crumbling at the hands of someone they never considered dangerous. Servants, now trembling witnesses, had fled into the fields. Some wailed, others simply stood in stunned silence, hands to their mouths, eyes refusing to believe what they'd seen. But Absalom was gone. The floor he'd once cleaned bore no sign of his passing. No prints in the dust, no blood on his hands. No witness could swear they even saw him leave. The white men who survived, the ones who didn't drink, launched an immediate search. Bloodhounds were loosed across the parish. Rewards were offered. Suspicion fell on every black man within 10 miles. Whippings resumed. Interrogations began. But not a single soul spoke. Even under the lash, the slaves said nothing. Not because they were afraid, but because for the first time in generations, they weren't. Absalom had done what no one thought possible. He had cut off the head of the snake with nothing but silence, patience, and a vial of liquid retribution. What happens when a man becomes a myth, When his name stops being whispered in fear and starts being whispered in hope. It started small, a rumor, a bedtime story, a whispered prayer beneath a cotton stalk. He walked into the great house and made the masters choke on their own. Greed, they say he don't even speak, but his silence kills. They found a goblet buried under the cypress tree, and the ground won't grow back there no more. Within weeks, across plantations from Louisiana to Mississippi, slaves began using a new name when they talked about freedom, revenge, or escape. The Silent One. Children asked if he was real. Old women swore they once saw him in the swamp, standing so still the moss grew around him. Some said he became a shadow. Some said he reached New Orleans, where abolitionists smuggled him north. Others believed he stayed in the bayou, watching, waiting for another feast. Ezekiel. No one ever found him either. Some believe he walked into the fire that night, content to burn the world that burned him. Others say he escaped and lives under a false name, still growing herbs in secret, teaching others the science of quiet rebellion. But the one thing no one denied was that 10 powerful men died in one night, with no bullet, no riot, no army, just wine, and a man who had learned to be invisible until the moment he chose not to be. How many more Absaloms were there? How many silent rebels stood behind dining chairs, holding trays, memorizing floorboards, gathering names? Yards South would never say it out loud. But after that night, every master flinched when their goblet was poured. Every overseer kept one eye on the shadows. And in the quarters, beneath the sting of the whip and the ache of long days, one thing spread faster than fear. Faith. Faith that silence could be sharper than steel. That justice could arrive, not with a scream, but with a toast. That no one is invisible forever. The Delacroix plantation eventually changed hands. The great hall was scrubbed. New families moved in. They hung new paintings on the walls and built new fences around the property. But the wood still creaks in the same places. And on some nights, when the wind shifts and the cicadas scream louder than usual, they say you can hear the faint sound of glass tipping, of something thick spilling on polished oak, and of footsteps, barefoot, slow, walking away. 10 men died, but what truly perished that night was the illusion of control, and what rose in its place was a legend, Absalom, the silent, rebel of Louisiana. A man with no voice, no chains, and no master. His story was never written in the history books, but in the fields, in the forests, in the hearts of those still bound. He never truly disappeared. Stories like this must never be forgotten, because history doesn't just live in textbooks. It lives in whispers, in scars, in legends that refuse to die. If you want to uncover more untold truths, more names buried in silence, stay with us, because what comes next is even darker